If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now. Because what happened to my daughter on the marble steps of the Ashcroft Winter Gala is the reason I stopped hiding who I really am. 3 years ago, I made a promise. I promised myself that my daughter would never know the truth about me. Not the truth about the calls I used to take at 2 in the morning. Not the truth about the men who used to stand outside our door in suits that cost more than our old apartment. Not the truth about the name people used to whisper when they thought I couldn't hear them. Vesper. They called me the Mafia Queen. And for 3 years, I buried her. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I didn't bury her because I was ashamed. I buried her because I looked at my daughter's face the night her father died, and I made a choice. I chose her over the throne. I chose diapers over deals. I chose double shifts at a diner in a town nobody important has ever heard of over an empire that spanned 4 continents. My husband's name was Danielle Reeves. He wasn't part of my old world at all, which is exactly why I loved him the way I did. He ran a small music shop 2 blocks from the apartment we shared, and he taught me that a life could be quiet and still be full. When he died, it wasn't a bullet or a rival or anything that belonged to my old world. It was his heart, plain and unfair, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. I remember standing in the hospital hallway holding Zuri, who was 13 then, and understanding with total clarity that I had exactly one job left in this life. Keep her safe. Keep her far away from anything that could ever look at her the way people used to look at me. I handed the throne to the one man I trusted enough to hold it, and I walked away from an empire the way other women walk away from a bad job. I never looked back. I told myself I never would. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. The throne doesn't disappear just because you turn your back on it. It waits. And on a cold Friday night in December, it came looking for me, dressed in candlelight and violins, at the one place I thought my daughter was finally safe. My name is Danielle Reeves. I work the evening shift at a diner called Rosalie's, 3 miles from Ashcroft Preparatory Academy, the private school my daughter Zuri got into on a full scholarship for violin. I wear an apron with a coffee stain that never comes out, no matter how many times I wash it. I drive a car with a check engine light that's been on so long I've named it. And until that December night, exactly 0 people at that school knew who I used to be. Most nights at Rosalie's look the same. I refill coffee for truckers who tip in quarters and regulars who call me Hon without ever learning my name. A few weeks before the gala, a man in an expensive coat sat in my section, glanced at my name tag, and told his friend, loud enough for me to hear, that people who wait tables at 40 must not have figured life out yet. I smiled, refilled his water, and walked away. Because I had learned a long time ago that the people who need you to feel small are rarely worth the energy it takes to correct them. I went home that night, kissed my daughter on the forehead while she practiced her scales, and didn't think about that man again. I had no idea how many more people like him were waiting for me at that school. Zuri didn't know either. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights. My own daughter didn't know her mother used to be the most feared woman in 3 countries. To her, I was just Mum. Tired Mum. Double shift Mum. The mum who fell asleep on the couch with grease still under her fingernails while her daughter practiced scales in the next room. She was 16. She had her father's steady hands and my stubborn chin, and she could make a violin cry in 4 different languages before she could legally drive. The scholarship to Ashcroft wasn't charity. She earned it, note by note, in an audition that left 3 judges speechless. I cried in the school parking lot the day the acceptance letter came, and it wasn't because of the free tuition. It was because for 1 whole year, my daughter got to walk through a world I could never give her on a waitress's paycheck, and she never had to know what it cost me to keep smiling and stay quiet while she did it. The Winter Gala was supposed to be her big night. Ashcroft threw it every December to squeeze donations out of the parents who could afford marble floors and chandeliers the size of Volkswagens. The school's top music students performed for the crowd, and this year, for the first time, the scholarship program got a showcase slot. Zuri was going to play her father's violin in front of 200 of the wealthiest families in the state. She'd been practicing the same 6 minutes of music for 8 weeks straight. I used to stand in her doorway some nights just to listen. She didn't know I was there. I liked it that way. It felt like the one part of her life that was still just ours. Getting into Ashcroft hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick. Zuri auditioned twice, the first time at 14 when the judges told her, kindly but firmly, that her technique was there, but her interpretation needed another year to mature. She didn't cry about it, didn't even complain, just went back to the same practice room above the diner's storage closet, the only space quiet enough after my shifts ended, and worked through every note of her next audition piece until her fingers cracked in the cold. When the second acceptance letter came, it wasn't luck. It was a year of 6A. M. Mornings before school, and every spare hour after homework, chosen deliberately over sleep, over friends, over almost everything a normal 16-year-old gets to have. I never once had to tell her to practice. If anything, I had to remind her to stop. The night of the gala, I picked up an extra shift because gas doesn't pay for itself, and I told Zuri I'd get there before her performance slot, even if I had to run the last quarter mile in my work shoes. She told me not to worry, that her friend Priya's parents were driving her, and that Julian was going to save me a seat. Julian Cross. Her lab partner turned something more. The boy she'd been quietly, sweetly nervous about since October. I'd met him twice. He seemed fine. Polite in the careful, performative way rich kids get raised to be polite. I didn't think much of him either way. I should have. Zura's closest friend at Ashcroft was a girl named Priya Anand, a scholarship kid herself, on financial aid for debate rather than music, and the two of them had found each other the way kids from ordinary families always seem to find each other in rooms built for money. Priya had warned Zuri more than once that Bianca Kensington had a pattern. Freshman year, she'd cornered a girl in the art wing over a misplaced ceramics project. Sophomore year, a scholarship boy on the robotics team had quietly transferred out mid-semester after Bianca convinced the whole team he'd sabotaged their competition entry. Nobody could ever prove any of it, because proof, in a school like Ashcroft, had a way of disappearing the moment it threatened a family that sat on the board. Zuri used to shrug it off. "She's never actually come after me," she told Priya once. "I keep my head down. I just play." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else from that whole year. I want to tell you what happened next, exactly the way it happened, because for a long time, people tried to convince the world it went differently. Zuri arrived at 6:30 in a navy dress she'd bought second-hand and altered herself, her father's violin case in her hand like she was carrying something holy. She found her seat near the front, next to Priya, 3 rows behind the Kensington family, who owned roughly a third of downtown, and sat on the Ashcroft board like they'd been carved into their chairs. Bianca Kensington was Zuri's classmate. Bianca's mother, Vanessa Kensington, chaired the gala committee and had chaired it for 6 years running. And everyone at that school understood, without ever being told directly, that Vanessa Kensington's approval was worth more than any teacher's. At 7:15, according to 4 separate witnesses, Bianca approached Zuri's table, holding a glass of red wine. What happened next depends on who you ask, but here's what actually happened, because I found out every second of it later, frame by frame. Bianca didn't trip. She turned, deliberate and slow, and let the wine tip out of her glass directly onto the cream-coloured gown of one of the gala's biggest donors, a woman named Charlotte Winthrop, who screamed loud enough to stop the string quartet mid-measure. And before Charlotte Winthrop had even finished gasping, Bianca pointed straight at my daughter. She bumped me. I saw her elbow. She did it on purpose. 16 years old, and my daughter didn't even understand what was happening fast enough to defend herself. 200 people turned to stare at the scholarship kid in the second-hand dress. Vanessa Kensington was already moving, already performing outrage for the donors around her, already saying the words that would end my daughter's night before it started. "Get security. I want her out of my gala." Zuri stood up, hands shaking, trying to explain she hadn't moved from her chair in 10 minutes, that Bianca had walked toward her, not the other way around. Nobody was listening. That's the thing about rooms full of money. They don't listen to the people who don't have any. If you've ever been in a room where everyone decided who you were before you said a single word, drop your city in the comments below. I want to know how many of us have lived this. Security reached her table in under a minute. 2 men in earpieces, moving like she was a threat instead of a 16-year-old girl in a second-hand dress. One of them grabbed her arm. The other reached for the violin case, and when Zuri instinctively pulled it back, protecting the one thing in that room that was truly hers, it slipped from both their hands and hit the marble floor. The case popped open on impact. Her father's violin, the one thing of his she had left. the one he bought with his first real paycheck and taught her to hold before she could write her own name, cracked down the neck in front of 200 people who had already decided she deserved it. She didn't cry at first. She just stood there, staring at the broken wood like the floor had opened up beneath her. Then Bianca laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A satisfied one. Guess the charity case doesn't get to perform tonight. Zuri tried one more time as they pulled her toward the doors, her voice small against the noise of the ballroom. Please, I have to perform. I've been practicing for 2 months. Please just let me explain. One of the guards, a younger man who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, muttered, I'm sorry, kid. Mrs. Kensington runs this event. We just do what we're told. It wasn't kindness. It was an apology dressed up as an excuse, and it didn't slow either of them down for even a second. The security guards walked my daughter out through the front entrance, past the step and repeat banner, where photographers were still snapping photos of arriving donors, past 100 phones that were already filming, and deposited her on the front steps of Ashcroft Preparatory Academy like she was trash somebody needed to take out. I found out because Priya called me, crying so hard I could barely understand her. I left my shift without clocking out. I didn't change out of my apron. I drove faster than I had in 3 years, and when I got to those front steps, my daughter was sitting on cold marble in December, in a dress she'd sewn herself, holding the broken pieces of her father's violin in her lap, and she was shaking. I want you to understand what almost happened in that moment, because the version of me that used to run an empire wanted to walk back through those doors and remind an entire room why grown men used to go pale at the sound of my name. But I looked at my daughter's face, and I chose the version of myself I'd built for her instead. I knelt down, I wrapped my arms around her, and I let her cry into my shoulder while my work shoes soaked through on the cold stone. Mum, I didn't do anything. I swear I didn't do anything. I know, baby. I know you didn't. That's when Vanessa Kensington walked out those same doors, heels clicking against marble like a countdown, trailed by 2 board members and, I'd learn later, her husband Gerald, who stayed several careful steps behind her, the way men do when they know a scene is being staged and don't want their name in it. You need to leave the property, Vanessa said, looking at me the way people look at something they've stepped in. Both of you. And you can consider her scholarship under review starting Monday. I stood up slowly. 3 years of practiced stillness kept my voice level. My daughter didn't touch anyone. Excuse me? Vanessa's laugh had an edge like broken glass. I don't believe I asked for your opinion. You're the one who works at that little diner off Route 9, aren't you? I've seen you. You should be thanking us for letting her in here at all. I felt my daughter's hand tighten around mine. That's the only reason I didn't say what I wanted to say next. A small crowd of parents had gathered near the entrance by then, drawn by the commotion. Phones half raised, nobody quite brave enough to say anything out loud. I recognized the particular silence of people who agree with what's happening but don't want their name attached to saying so. Get off our property, Vanessa repeated. Before I have security escort you both to your car. And do try to clean yourself up. You're embarrassing her enough as it is. One of the parents near the doors, a woman I didn't recognize, murmured to her husband just loud enough for me to catch it. I heard the mum works at that diner on Route 9. Honestly, what did she expect, sending her kid here? Her husband nodded like this was reasonable, like the entire event made perfect sense once you remembered which family didn't belong. Behind her, half hidden near the entrance, I saw Julian. Zuri's Julian. The boy who was supposed to save me a seat. He wasn't looking at Vanessa. He was looking at Bianca, who'd come out to watch the show, and the look on his face wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Julian, Zuri said, voice cracking. Tell them. You saw what happened. You know I didn't do it. He hesitated exactly long enough to answer the question without saying anything at all. I mean, I didn't really see the whole thing, Zuri. Maybe you should have just been more careful. That was the moment something in my daughter's face closed like a door. Not just the humiliation of the fall. The betrayal underneath it. Bianca had thrown the wine. Vanessa had thrown the accusation. Security had thrown my daughter onto the steps like trash nobody wanted to look at anymore. And the boy she liked had just quietly thrown away the one chance to tell the truth, because the truth was inconvenient for whoever he wanted to keep as friends. I helped my daughter to her feet. gathered the broken pieces of her father's violin into the case, and walked her to the car without another word to any of them. But as we passed the valet stand, a man in a dark wool coat stepped out to let his car go by, and for 1/2 second, his eyes landed on the ring on my right hand. The one I never take off. The one with a small black stone that means absolutely nothing to anyone who doesn't already know exactly what it means. He went pale. Not startled pale. Recognize pale. The kind of pale that comes from a memory, not a first impression. He looked at my face like he was trying to place it against a photograph he'd only ever seen once, a long time ago, in a room he wasn't supposed to talk about. Then he looked away fast, got into a black car with tinted windows, and left without another glance. I didn't think much of it that night. I was too busy holding my daughter together to notice that the throne I'd buried for 3 years had just quietly opened one eye. There was a version of that night that lived only in my memory, one I never let surface in front of Zuri. A version where I remembered exactly what it felt like to walk into a room and watch grown men rearrange their entire posture around my presence. I remembered boardrooms in 3 languages, deals signed because I nodded, and not because the numbers made sense, and one particular winter years earlier when a rival organization tried to test my patience and learned, very quickly, why nobody tested it twice. I had buried all of it under work shifts and school pickups and grocery budgets, and I had been almost proud of how thoroughly I'd buried it. Almost. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Zuri sat with the broken violin case in her lap like she was holding a body. When we got inside our small apartment, she went straight to her room and shut the door, and I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to her cry through the wall, feeling every year of the woman I used to be pressing against the version of me I'd chosen instead. I want to be honest with you. I could have ended this in one phone call that night. I didn't make it. Not yet. Because some part of me still believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, my daughter's life could stay clean of everything I used to be. Monday morning, the school released a statement. Not an apology. A statement. It said Zuri's scholarship status was under formal review pending an investigation into an altercation, and that Ashcroft Preparatory Academy takes the safety and comfort of its full-paying families extremely seriously. Full-paying families. Like my daughter's talent had never been the reason she was there. Like a violin scholarship was a favor they could revoke the moment it became inconvenient. By Tuesday, video from someone's phone had made it onto social media. Not video of the whine, or the accusation, or security dragging a 16-year-old out the front doors. Just a clip of my daughter sitting on the steps, crying, with the caption, "Scholarship kid causes scene at Ashcroft Gala, gets escorted out." The comments were exactly as ugly as you'd expect from people who'd already decided which side of the room they belonged to. Zuri stopped eating breakfast that week. She stopped practicing. I'd walk past her door and hear silence where there used to be bark. That silence is what finally made the decision for me. Wednesday night, after Zuri fell asleep, I sat at our kitchen table with my phone in my hand for almost an hour before I finally opened a contact I hadn't touched in 3 years. A number with no name attached to it, just a string of digits that would only ring through to one person on Earth. He picked up on the second ring, and I heard something in his voice shift the moment he realized who was calling. "It's been a long time, Your Majesty. Only one man in the world still calls me that. His name is Ryu Hyun-woo. And for the last 3 years, he has sat on a throne that was never really his, keeping the peace in my absence, waiting the way loyal men wait, without ever once asking me to come back. I chose him myself, a long time ago, out of a room full of men who wanted the position far more than they deserved it. Ryu never asked for it. He was the only one who didn't. I told him once that this was exactly why he was the only one I trusted with it. In 9 years working under me, and 3 years holding the seat in my place, he never took a single dollar that wasn't his, never raised a hand against anyone who hadn't earned it, and never, not once, called me for anything that wasn't worth interrupting the life I'd chosen instead. Until that Wednesday night. "I need eyes on a family," I said. "The Kensingtons. Ashcroft Preparatory Academy. And I need it quiet." Understood. A pause. "Are you well?" "My daughter isn't. That's the only thing that matters right now." "Then it matters to me too." Ryu explained it to me plainly, the way he'd always explained things, without wasted words. Gerald Kensington has been trying to get a meeting with me for 8 months, through 3 different intermediaries. Men like him always want the same thing eventually. Clean money to stand next to, so nobody asks where the rest of it came from. I agreed to the gala mostly out of curiosity. I didn't expect to find your daughter in the middle of it. I didn't know it yet, but Ryu Hyun-woo had been at that gala Friday night. Not as a stranger. As a guest, seated 3 tables from the Kensingtons, quietly evaluating Gerald Kensington as a potential financial partner for a legitimate real estate venture, the kind of clean, boring business deal that lets old organizations launder their reputations into respectability over time. He'd left before the incident with Zuri, called away by a phone call from one of his own men. But his driver hadn't left. His driver was the man in the wool coat at the valet stand who'd gone pale at the sight of my ring. By Thursday morning, Ryu called me back. "I have information you're going to want in person," he said. "And Danielle, I think it's time you came back to the city, just for a few days. Bring Zuri if you're comfortable, or leave her somewhere safe. Either way, I think you need to see what I'm looking at." I chose to bring her, not because I was ready to tell her everything, because I couldn't leave her alone in that apartment while she stopped eating and stopped playing music. I told her we were going to visit an old friend of mine in the city, someone who might be able to help with the school situation. She was too tired to argue. We met Ryu at a restaurant he owns, one of several legitimate businesses that keep his organization's books clean on paper. Zuri sat across from a man with tattoos climbing up from his collar and steel in his eyes, and I watched her try to figure out exactly what kind of family friend this was supposed to be. She wasn't wrong to wonder. Ryu didn't waste time on small talk. He slid a folder across the table, and inside it was everything his people had pulled together in 3 days, which, if you know anything about how thorough his people are, tells you exactly how much they found. Vanessa Kensington had chaired the Ashcroft Gala Committee for 6 years, and in that time, the gala's declared donation totals had never once matched the amount that actually reached the school's scholarship fund. The difference, according to invoices Ryu's people had quietly obtained, had gone toward renovations on the Kensington family's lake house, a European vacation logged as a board retreat, and a wardrobe consulting retainer billed to the school's charitable foundation. Headmaster Edmund Dorsey had personally signed off on 7 admission exceptions over 4 years for students whose families made substantial private donations directly to him, bypassing the school's actual admissions committee entirely. 2 of those exceptions were currently enrolled in Zuri's grade, and Bianca Kensington wasn't new to this. 18 months earlier, at a regional music competition, a scholarship student named Renata Ibarra had accused Bianca of stealing a piece of her original composition and performing it as her own. The accusation had been quietly buried after Vanessa made a donation to the competition's sponsoring foundation. Renata Ibarra had left that program entirely by the following semester. There was one more name in that folder I hadn't expected. Miss Alvarez, the school's music director, the woman who had personally recommended Zuri for the showcase slot. According to a private memo Ryu's people had obtained, Miss Alvarez had reported concerns about Bianca's conduct towards scholarship students twice in the past 2 years, both times to Headmaster Dorsey directly, and both times had been quietly told to let it go if she wanted her contract renewed. She'd said nothing publicly since. Not because she didn't care, because she had a mortgage and a job market that didn't forgive teachers who made waves. "There's a pattern here," Ryu said. "It isn't your daughter. It's never been about your daughter. It's a system that protects certain families and disposes of everyone else, and it's been running for years." Zuri had gone very quiet, listening to all of this. Finally, she looked at Ryu, then at me. There was a photograph clipped to the back of the folder, one Zuri lingered on longer than the rest. It showed Bianca and 2 other students standing over a younger girl in what looked like a school hallway, taken 2 years earlier by a student who'd since transferred out. Nobody had ever done anything with it. It had just sat in a discarded phone backup for 2 years, waiting for someone with the resources to go looking for it. Why does he have this? Why does anyone care this much about a school gala? I looked at my daughter, 16 years old, sitting across from a man whose organization used to answer to me directly, and I understood that the moment had finally come, whether I was ready for it or not. "Because I asked him to look into it," I said. "Because I used to be someone very different before you were born, Zuri. And that person is the only reason anyone found this in 3 days instead of 3 years." "What do you mean, someone different?" I could have softened it. I didn't. They used to call me the Mafia Queen. I ran an organization that operated across 4 countries. I stepped away from it the year your father died because I wanted you to grow up somewhere none of that could ever touch you. I'm sorry I never told you. I thought I was protecting you. My daughter stared at me for a long moment, and I watched 16 years of assumptions rearrange themselves behind her eyes. The late-night calls she used to hear through the wall as a little girl, and never questioned. The 2 men who used to sit outside our old apartment building when she was a toddler, who I told her were friends of your father's. The way I could always, somehow, make hard things disappear, and she'd never once asked how. "You're serious," she finally said. "I'm serious. So what happens now?" I reached across the table and took her hand. "Now I stop hiding." If you felt that shift the way I did in that moment, drop the word queen in the comments below, because everything that happened after that dinner moved fast, and none of it was subtle. The first thing Ryu did was make 3 phone calls before we'd even finished dessert. By Friday morning, the luthier who had restored my late husband's violin 15 years earlier, a man named Otto Faber who almost never takes new clients and hadn't spoken to me in over a decade, called Zuri directly. He told her he'd already received the broken instrument through a courier, and that he would either restore it exactly as it had been or build her something entirely new, whichever she wanted, at no cost, because an old friend asked me to. By Friday afternoon, the Ashcroft School Board received a call from 3 of their largest anonymous donors, all within an hour of each other, all asking pointed questions about a recent incident involving a scholarship student and whether the school's handling of it reflected the values those donors thought they were funding. None of those donors had ever spoken to me. All 3 had, at some point in their careers, done business with organizations connected to Ryu. By Saturday, Headmaster Dorsey personally called our apartment, his voice noticeably higher than it had been in any of his previous statements, to inform me that the school had reconsidered its position and that Zuri's scholarship was fully reinstated with immediate effect, along with a personal invitation to perform at the school's upcoming Winter Showcase concert the following weekend, the school's biggest public event of the year, broadcast to alumni and donors nationwide. Zuri looked at me across the kitchen table after that call and asked the question I knew was coming. "Are you doing all of this?" "I'm making sure the truth has room to breathe," I said. "Whether you win that scholarship back forever is still up to you. Nobody can play that violin for you. But you could make them let me back in even if I hadn't been telling the truth, couldn't you?" I didn't lie to her. "Yes, I could have. I didn't, because you didn't need me to. You told the truth from the very first second. I just made sure people who were paid to ignore it finally had to listen." By Sunday, the same local news station that had briefly picked up the scholarship kid, Cause's Scene Clip, ran a follow-up segment, this time with an interview from Renata Ibarra's mother about what had happened to her daughter 18 months earlier. The tone of the coverage had flipped entirely, from a story about an unruly scholarship student to a story about a school that had spent years quietly protecting the wrong people. Nobody at the station knew who had pointed them toward Renata's family. I didn't need them to know. She thought about that for a long time before she finally nodded. And later that night, for the first time in 8 days, I heard music through her bedroom wall again. The following Tuesday, Otto Faber personally delivered a new violin to our apartment door, a case handcrafted from spruce and maple that he said would outlive us both, carved with a small detail near the scroll that matched, almost exactly, the one her father's violin had carried. Zuri opened the case and cried for an entirely different reason than she had on those cold marble steps. But the school's sudden reversal hadn't come from kindness. It had come from fear, and fear doesn't stay quiet for long. By Wednesday, Vanessa Kensington had figured out that someone with real power was moving pieces behind the scenes, and rather than back down, she doubled her aggression the way people like her always do when they're cornered. She called an emergency meeting of the Ashcroft Parent Association, framing the scholarship reinstatement as an outside party attempting to intimidate the school's leadership, and quietly began reaching out to other board members and donors to build support for reversing the decision entirely. Bianca, meanwhile, started a rumor at school that Zuri's mother had threatened the headmaster, which within 2 days had transformed, through the particular alchemy of teenage gossip, into a story that I had personally shown up at the school with some kind of gang. At that emergency meeting, according to the recording Ryu's people later obtained, Vanessa stood in front of a dozen board members and parents and painted herself as the victim of outside intimidation. Most of the room nodded along out of habit, the way rooms full of comfortable people tend to do. But one father, a man named Theo Whitfield, whose son had transferred to Ashcroft the previous year, finally spoke up. "With respect, Vanessa, I watched the video like everyone else. That girl didn't do anything. Maybe instead of figuring out how to reverse the decision, we should be asking why it took outside pressure to make the right one in the first place." Vanessa didn't have an answer for that. She just moved on to the next item on her agenda like he hadn't spoken at all, which told me everything about how long she'd been getting away with exactly that. I let it run for exactly 3 more days, because I wanted every single person circling my daughter to show me, clearly and on the record, exactly who they were. Ryu's people documented all of it. Every call Vanessa made to pressure board members, every message Bianca sent pushing the rumor further. Every moment, Headmaster Dorsey privately reassured Vanessa that this will blow over while publicly claiming to support Zuri's reinstatement. The night before the winter showcase, Ryu called me with the final piece. "There's something you should see before tomorrow," he said. "Gerald Kensington's real estate fund, the one he was pitching to me at the gala. About 60% of its listed investors don't exist. He's been running new donor money through the fund to pay off old investors and cover losses for almost 2 years. If anyone pulls that thread publicly, the entire fund collapses, and so does his family's financial standing. Do you have documentation? Enough to end it in one conversation with the right journalist. I've held it back until you told me to move." "Not yet," I said. "Tomorrow night, at the showcase, in front of everyone who needs to see it." The winter showcase was held in the same gilded ballroom where my daughter had been dragged out like garbage 8 days earlier, and this time I walked through the front doors instead of standing outside them. I didn't wear my apron. I wore the kind of dress I hadn't put on in 3 years, the kind that used to make entire rooms go quiet before I said a single word. And I watched exactly that happen the moment I stepped through the entrance with Ryu Hyun-woo at my side. Vanessa Kensington saw me first. Her face did something complicated, somewhere between confusion and denial, the same way people react when they see something that shouldn't be possible standing right in front of them. She started toward me, already reaching for the same tone she'd used on the marble steps. "I don't believe you were invited back onto this, Vanessa." Ryu said her name quietly, and something in his voice made 3 separate board members standing near her go completely silent and take a half step back. I'd choose my next words very carefully if I were you. "Excuse me? Who exactly do you think you are?" "I think," Ryu said, "that you're currently standing in a room with the woman my entire organization answers to. And I think you've spent the last 8 days trying to intimidate her daughter's school into reversing a decision they only made because they were finally forced to tell the truth." The room had gone quiet enough that his words carried to nearly every table. "That's absurd," Vanessa said, laughing the way people laugh when they're already losing. "She's a waitress. I've seen her apron." "She's also the reason your husband's real estate fund is still standing," Ryu said, which, given what I found in his books this week, is more generosity than he deserves. Gerald Kensington, 3 tables away, went the colour of the tablecloths. Headmaster Dorsey approached next, sweating through his collar, clearly trying to figure out which direction safety lay in. "Mrs. Reeves, we had no idea. If we had known your, connections, we would have handled the entire situation completely differently from the start." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was to treat my daughter like a human being. You should have looked at the evidence in front of you and done the right thing on Friday night, when it was just a scholarship kid crying on your marble steps and nobody thought there'd be consequences for getting it wrong." I let that land before I continued. "So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, an independent auditor is going through 6 years of gala donation records, admission exception approvals, and scholarship fund disbursements. Every family who bought their way into this school while a talented kid like Renata Ibarra got quietly pushed out is going to have their name in that report. And Mr. Kensington, you should probably call your attorney before the business section runs its story on Cross Harbour Realty tonight." Gerald Kensington actually stood up, chair scraping against marble. "You can't do that. That fund has real investors. Real families depend on... Then you should have thought about those real families before you started paying them with money from people who don't exist, I said. I'm not destroying anything, Mr. Kensington. I'm just done protecting you from the truth. Vanessa's voice cracked into something closer to panic than composure now. You have no right. This school, this gala, we built this community. Everyone here owes us. Nobody owes you anything, I said. Least of all a 16-year-old girl you humiliated in front of 200 people because your daughter spilled wine on a donor's dress and you decided it was easier to sacrifice a scholarship kid than admit your own daughter did something wrong. Bianca, standing near her mother, tried one last angle, her voice sharp with the particular cruelty of someone watching their whole world tilt sideways. This is ridiculous. She's still just the janitor's kid who got lucky with a violin. None of this changes what she actually is. I watched something shift in Julian's face as he stood near the back of the room, watching the girl he'd chosen to protect instead of the girl he'd claimed to care about, finally understanding exactly what kind of person he'd sided with when it mattered. Funny you'd say that, I said, because in about 10 minutes, my daughter is going to walk onto that stage and remind this entire room what actual talent sounds like. And every single person here who spent the last week deciding she didn't belong is going to sit there and listen to her prove them wrong without a single favor from me. Miss Alvarez stepped forward then, out of the crowd of teachers near the stage, her hands visibly shaking. I reported Bianca's behavior twice, she said, loud enough for the room to hear. 2 years ago and again last spring. Both times I was told to drop it if I wanted to keep my job. I should have said something the moment I saw what happened at this gala. I'm sorry, Zuri. You deserved a teacher who protected you instead of her own paycheck. It wasn't a big speech. It didn't need to be. It was the first honest thing an adult at that school had said out loud in 8 days, and I watched Headmaster Dorsey's face go slack as his own paper trail turned against him from a direction he clearly hadn't accounted for. Ryu leaned toward me slightly. Do you want me to pull the fun story tonight, or let the morning papers handle it? Morning, I said. Tonight belongs to my daughter. The showcase went on exactly as scheduled. Renata Ibarra's family, contacted quietly earlier that week by Ryu's team, with the documentation of what had happened to her, sat in the third row, invited back by the school in a gesture Headmaster Dorsey clearly hoped would look like decency rather than damage control. When it was Zuri's turn, she walked onto that stage in a dress she'd altered herself, holding a violin an old master craftsman had built her out of loyalty to a debt owed to her mother, and she played 6 minutes of music she had never once stopped believing in. Even during the week, everyone around her tried to convince her she didn't belong in that room. I watched her shoulders drop the way they always did once the first note left the string. That quiet transformation from a nervous 16-year-old into someone entirely sure of her place in a room. The chandeliers caught the same light they'd caught the week before, but this time nobody in that ballroom was looking anywhere except at her. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody spilled anything on anyone. When she finished, the silence lasted exactly 1 full second before the entire ballroom rose to its feet, and I watched my daughter's face catch up to what her hands had just done. Watched her realize, in real time, that this ovation belonged entirely to her. The next morning, the story broke exactly as Ryu said it would. Cross Harbor Realty collapsed under its own fraudulent weight within 72 hours, and Gerald Kensington's name became inseparable from it. The independent audit into Ashcroft's admissions and donation practices confirmed everything Ryu's people had found. And within 2 weeks, Headmaster Dorsey resigned to pursue other opportunities, which everyone correctly understood to mean he'd been quietly and permanently removed. Vanessa Kensington stepped down from the gala committee she'd chaired for 6 years and stopped showing her face at school events entirely once the story made the local news. Bianca finished out the semester in a noticeably emptier lunch table, having discovered exactly how many of her friendships had been built on her mother's committee seat rather than anything real. Renata Ibarra, whose stolen composition had finally been publicly credited to her, was accepted the following fall into the same conservatory summer program that had once quietly pushed her out. The following Monday, Ashcroft held an all-school assembly, the kind of hastily arranged gathering schools only call when they're trying to get ahead of a story before parents start calling in for answers themselves. The interim headmaster, a long-time assistant principal named Miss Okafor, who had clearly never wanted this job under these circumstances, stood in front of the entire student body and issued the first real apology anyone at that school had made since the whole thing began. She didn't mention me by name. She didn't have to. Every student in that auditorium had already seen the videos, read the audit, and watched two of the most powerful families at their school lose their grip on it within a single week. Priya told Zuri afterward that half the room had looked over at her during the apology, and for the first time since the gala, it hadn't felt like being stared at. It had felt like being seen. Priya heard, second-hand from another parent who'd overheard it in the parking lot, that Bianca turned on her mother the same night everything collapsed. "You told me none of this would ever touch us," Bianca reportedly said, voice shaking, as Vanessa tried to usher her toward the car before more cameras could catch her face. "You said being a Kensington meant nothing could ever go wrong." Vanessa didn't have an answer for her daughter either. I don't know if that story is exactly true in every detail, but I believe the shape of it, because I've watched enough people build their children's entire sense of safety on top of money and power, only to discover neither one holds up the way they promised it would. Julian never spoke to Zuri again after that night. I asked her once, weeks later, if that bothered her. "It used to," she said. "Now I just think about how fast he decided I wasn't worth defending. I don't think I lost much." 3 months later, Zuri received a formal invitation to audition for a prestigious young artists touring program, the kind that takes maybe a dozen musicians nationwide each year. I told her I could make a call if she wanted the door opened wider. She looked at me the way her father used to look at me, patient and a little amused, like she already knew exactly what I was going to say before she said it. "No offense, Mum, but I want this one to just be mine." She earned her spot on her own, 3 weeks later, in an audition room with judges who had never once heard the name Vesper. In the weeks after everything settled, Zuri asked me more questions than I expected, and fewer than I'd feared. She wanted to know if I'd ever hurt anyone. I told her the truth, that the world I used to run traded in fear and leverage far more often than violence, and that the reputation had always done more work than the reality ever needed to. She wanted to know why I never told her sooner. I told her the truth about that too, that I was scared if she knew what I used to be. She'd start looking at me differently, the way the whole city apparently did the moment Ryu said my old title out loud. She thought about that for a while before she answered. "I don't look at you differently," she finally said. "I just understand you a little more. There's a difference." That sentence undid something in me I didn't know was still tight. As for me, I never went back to hiding. I still work a shift at Rosalie's most weeks, because I like the ordinary rhythm of it, the sound of coffee pouring and regulars complaining about the weather, the version of my life that has nothing to do with thrones or empires. But I stopped pretending the other version of me didn't exist, and something about that honesty settled a weight in my chest I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Ryu Hyun-woo started showing up at Rosalie's on Thursday evenings, always ordering the same black coffee, always sitting in the corner booth like he had nowhere else on earth he needed to be. The other waitresses started teasing me about it before I'd even admitted to myself what it was. 3 weeks ago, he finally asked me to dinner somewhere that wasn't a diner and wasn't a business meeting, and I said yes, because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't choosing between the two versions of my life anymore. I was just choosing what came next for both of them, together. Zuri noticed before I said a word about it, the way 16-year-olds always notice everything you think you're hiding. You could do a lot worse than a guy who rebuilds a school's entire admissions system just because you asked him to, she told me, not looking up from her violin case. I didn't argue with her. Ryu never once tried to compete with Desmond's memory, and I think that's part of why I let him in as far as I have. He doesn't try to be the man who ran a music shop and taught me how to be ordinary. He's simply the man who never stopped guarding the door back to a life I once thought I'd have to give up forever, and who waited 9 years without once asking for anything in return. That kind of patience isn't something you find twice in one lifetime, and I'm not foolish enough to walk past it a second time. Last week, I stood in the back of a small recital hall and watched my daughter play for a room that had earned the right to hear her, on a violin built by a man who trusted a debt that was decades old, standing on a stage nobody could ever drag her off of again. When she finished, she found me in the crowd before she even looked at anyone else, and I realized that everything I'd buried 3 years ago, Every ounce of power I'd once held had only ever been worth anything the moment it finally protected the one person who mattered more than any throne ever could. They threw her out like trash on a cold marble staircase in December, certain that a scholarship kid in a second-hand dress could disappear without consequence. They forgot that trash doesn't come back. Queens do. Some nights, after Zuri's gone to bed, I still put on the old apron and sit in our kitchen with a cup of coffee I never made anyone tip me for, and I think about how close I came to letting an entire room decide my daughter's worth for her. I think about the version of me that almost stayed quiet, that almost let a school full of donors and board members write the ending to her story instead of her. I'm grateful, more than I know how to say, that I didn't let them. Desmond used to tell me that the measure of real power wasn't what you were willing to destroy. It was what you were willing to protect, quietly, for as long as it took, without ever needing credit for it. I believed him then. I believe him even more now, watching my daughter walk into rooms nobody can throw her out of anymore. If this story meant something to you, let me know what you'd have done in my shoes, and stick around, because Danielle Reeves is only getting started.